Commander stood before the Grand Council chamber, her four crystalline arms folded across her chest. The massive room buzzed with angry voices from 100 different species. Some chirped, some rumbled, some spoke in frequencies that needed translation devices. All of them were upset about the same thing. "This is madness," declared Representative, his blue skin rippling with indignation. The diplomat had brought charts and graphs projected in the air before him. "You want our cadets to study failure, to learn from species that threw away their lives for no gain. The mathematics are clear, Commander. These human last stands are simply elaborate forms of suicide." Had expected this reaction. She glanced at Professor, the old Meridian scholar who sat quietly at the side of the chamber. His three eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture of encouragement. He had brought this proposal to her 6 months ago, and she had spent every day since then reviewing the data. "With respect, Representative, you have not examined the full context," said. Her voice carried authority earned through 4 decades of military service. "Professor has analyzed over 10,000 battles from 300 civilizations. The pattern he discovered in human warfare is unprecedented." "Unprecedented stupidity," muttered one of the delegates, its mandibles clicking together. Professor rose slowly from his seat. Despite his age, his mind remained sharp as any blade. "May I present my findings?" he asked. The council had no choice but to listen. Waved one long finger and a holographic display materialized above the chamber floor. It showed a narrow mountain pass, rendered in ancient Earth colors. Small figures in red cloaks stood in formation. "Thermopylae, Earth year 480 BCE, began. 300 Spartan warriors held this pass against an invading force of approximately 200,000 Persian soldiers. The logical action would have been immediate retreat. Instead, they stayed for 3 days. They fought until every single one died." "As I said," interrupted, "suicide." "Let me finish," continued. His scholarly tone never wavered. "The Spartans died, yes, but their stand gave the Greek city-states time to organize. The unified Greek forces defeated the Persian invasion. One civilization's empire ended. Another's golden age began. The waste of 300 lives changed the course of human history." The council chamber fell quiet, advanced the display to another scene. The Alamo, Wake Island, Drift, Battle of Fortress. Each name brought a new holographic battlefield. Each one showed humans choosing to fight against impossible odds. In every case, the humans lost the immediate battle. In almost every case, their side won the larger war. Why? He paused, looking around the chamber. Because humans weaponized memory itself. They turned their defeats into rallying cries. They made their enemies pay such a terrible price for victory that the victory became meaningless. And they inspired their own people to fight harder, to never give up, to believe that even impossible battles could be won. Axe, a young cadet, sat in the observation gallery above the council floor. He had been required to attend this session as part of his command track studies. His analytical mind processed words and rejected them immediately. His people had perfected warfare through mathematics. You calculated force ratios, resource expenditure, and probability matrices. You never, ever threw away assets for emotional reasons. Beside him sat, her pale skin almost translucent in the chamber's light. The Whisper female had no military background at all. Her telepathic species had never known war until they joined the galactic community. She had enrolled in the academy to understand what her people called the violence puzzle, why other species hurt each other when cooperation was more efficient. On Axe's other side shifted his massive bulk. The warrior was built like a boulder with arms, his gray hide thick enough to stop most small arms fire. His people loved combat, lived for honor in battle, but even looked skeptical about these human tactics. What honor was there in a battle you knew you would lose? "The motion is passed," Commander announced, pulling Axe's attention back to the council floor. All cadets will complete the new curriculum on human last stand strategies. Professor will design the course. Classes begin next cycle. The three cadets looked at each other. Axe's face showed his distaste, appeared curious, just grunted. 2 weeks later, they sat in their first class together. Professor stood before 40 cadets from 20 different species. Behind him, the holographic display showed Thermopylae again. "You will watch," said simply, "then we will discuss." The display came alive. The cadets saw the narrow pass, the small force of Spartans in their bronze armor, and the massive Persian army approaching like a dark flood. The Spartans could have retreated. The pass led to open ground behind them. Instead, they formed their battle line and waited. The Persians attacked in waves. Each wave broke against the Spartan formation. Bodies piled up in the narrow space. The Spartans fought with spears and shields, then swords when the spears broke, then bare hands when the swords were lost. The simulation did not hide the blood, the exhaustion, or the fear in their eyes. When a traitor showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass, the Spartans knew they were doomed. Their king sent most of his force away to fight another day. He kept 300 volunteers who knew they would die. The final stand lasted hours. Every Spartan fell. The Persians won the pass. The hologram faded. Axe immediately raised his hand. "Waste," he said flatly. 300 trained warriors thrown away. If they had retreated, those soldiers could have fought in the later battles that actually won the war. Perhaps acknowledged. "Calculate for me, Cadet Axe. What is the mathematical value of inspiration?" Axe blinked his two large eyes. "Inspiration cannot be. Yet it must have value, or humans would not have employed it so consistently across their entire history." Brought up another display. After Thermopylae, the Greeks fought with what human historians called unprecedented unity and fury. They spoke of the 300 constantly. They swore to avenge them. Does this factor into your mathematics? Axe had no answer. Raised her hand tentatively. "Professor, I sense something in these historical records. The humans who made these stands, they were afraid, terribly afraid, but they stayed anyway. Why?" "An excellent question, Cadet. Perhaps by the end of this course, you will find your answer." The classes continued over the following months. Each session presented another human last stand. The cadets learned about the Alamo, where fewer than 200 defenders faced thousands of Mexican soldiers. They all died, but "Remember the Alamo" became a battle cry that helped Texas win its independence. They studied Drift, where 150 British soldiers defended a mission station against 4,000 Zulu warriors. The soldiers held, but just barely, and the battle became legendary. They examined, where 21 Sikhs faced 10,000 tribesmen. All 21 died, but they held the communication post long enough to warn other British positions. The enemy lost 600 men taking it. Wake Island Castle, the list went on. Some last stands succeeded in holding, most did not. But all of them followed the same pattern, humans choosing to fight when logic said flee. Axe grew more frustrated with each lesson. The waste of it offended his analytical nature. Became more fascinated, trying to understand the emotional calculus involved. Remained silent, but he attended every class and watched every display with increasing intensity. 6 months into the course, Commander appeared in their classroom. Her presence made every cadet straighten immediately. She rarely taught classes anymore, too busy with administrative duties and strategic planning. "Professor," she said formally, "may I address your students?" Stepped aside with a small bow. Looked over the cadets with her sharp eyes. "You have been studying human last stand tactics for half a year now. Most of you think this is an academic exercise. It is not." She gestured, and a new holographic display appeared. It showed a star map with a dark mass moving through it like a stain spreading across fabric. "This is the Devourer fleet," said quietly. a machine intelligence that has consumed 3 entire galactic sectors. Every civilization they encounter either flees or surrenders after calculating the odds of victory. Every one of those civilizations has been eliminated anyway. The classroom went completely silent. The Devourers are coming here, continued. Our long-range sensors detected them 4 days ago. They will reach the galactic border in approximately 18 months. The Grand Council is currently debating our response. She turned back to face the cadets directly. We are teaching you human last-stand strategies because we may need to employ them. The Devourers understand logic. They calculate force ratios and probability matrices just like you do, Cadet Axe. But they have never encountered an enemy that fights when fighting is mathematically impossible. That unpredictability may be our only advantage. Axe felt his blood chill. Beside him, Skin had gone even paler. Leaned forward, his warrior instincts fully engaged now. Next week, announced, you will participate in a simulation. You will command a border station facing a devourer assault with impossible odds. You will apply what you have learned about human tactics, and we will see if these strategies can save lives instead of merely spending them. She left the classroom as abruptly as she had entered. The cadets sat in stunned silence. Professor smiled sadly. Now you understand why this course is mandatory, he said. The question is no longer whether last stands are logical. The question is whether you can execute one when everything in your nature screams at you to flee, because that choice may determine if your species survives. The simulation began on a cold morning that felt appropriate despite the climate-controlled environment of the academy. Axe stood with his team in the command center of a virtual border station. The holographic displays around them looked completely real. If he forgot for a moment, he could believe he was actually aboard Station Meridian, humanity's name for this scenario. The station housed 10,000 civilians according to the simulation parameters, mostly families of the military personnel stationed there, plus some traders and diplomats. The defensive force consisted of 40 ships and 15,000 troops. The weapons were outdated by a generation. The shields were adequate for normal piracy, but nothing more. Axe reviewed the tactical display and felt his stomach drop. 127 Devourer ships were approaching. Their weapons could tear through the station's shields in minutes. Their troops, if they chose to board, would outnumber the defenders 10-1. Standard military protocol was clear. Evacuate and retreat. Save what you can and withdraw to a defensive position where reinforcements can support you. Axe's training demanded this choice. But the simulation had one nasty twist that Professor had designed personally. The nearest reinforcement fleet was 2 weeks away. If Station Meridian fell, the Devourers would have access to hyperspace lanes that led directly to 4 core worlds, with a combined population of 8 billion people. Retreat meant the defenders survived. It also meant billions died later. Stand and fight meant the defenders died. But they might delay the Devourers long enough for the reinforcement fleet to arrive and seal off the hyperspace lanes. This is impossible, Axe said aloud. His team looked at him, 3 other cadets from different species, all of them as disturbed as he was by the scenario. We cannot win this battle. That is correct, confirmed the simulation AI in its neutral tone. Current probability of successful defense, 0.03%. Recommend immediate evacuation. Stood at the communications station. Her telepathic abilities were limited in simulations, but she could still sense the emotional states of her teammates. What would the humans do? She asked softly. Had been staring at the tactical display in silence. Now he spoke, his deep voice rumbling. They would fight. But we'll die, one of the other cadets protested. All of us for nothing. Not for nothing, said. He pointed at the display showing the hyperspace lanes. For them, for the billions who will die if we run. Axe wanted to argue. Every instinct in his body demanded he choose the logical path. His people had spent perfecting the mathematics of survival. You never sacrificed assets without guaranteed return. You never fought unwinnable battles. But he thought of the 300 Spartans standing in that narrow pass. They had known they would die. They stood anyway, and their civilization survived because of it. Simulation, Axe said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Begin civilian evacuation. All non-essential personnel to the transport ships. Military personnel and volunteers will remain to defend the station. Confirming order, the AI responded. This action significantly reduces survival probability for remaining personnel. I know, Axe said, do it anyway. The simulation accelerated. Civilian ships departed in orderly waves. Thousands of simulated people escaped. The defensive force that remained was now cut by half. Anyone who could leave had been ordered to do so. Only 7,000 troops remained, all volunteers according to the simulation's logic. Worked the communications panel, and Axe was surprised to see her broadcasting on all frequencies, not just military channels. What are you doing? Something I learned from the Alamo recordings, she said. The defenders sent out messages explaining why they were staying. They wanted people to know their reasons. She played back what she had recorded. In her clear voice, speaking in the galactic trade language, she said, "This is Station Meridian. We are staying to defend the hyperspace lanes. We know we cannot win. We are fighting anyway because someone has to. Because 8 billion people need 2 more weeks to prepare. Because we choose to stand." The message repeated across all bands. Axe watched the tactical display and realized what she had done. This was psychological warfare. The Devourers would receive that message. And if they were even slightly capable of analyzing enemy morale, they would recognize something they had never encountered before, an enemy that fought harder as hope decreased. The Devourer fleet arrived on schedule. They did not bother with negotiations or surrender demands. Machines did not waste time on such things. They simply began their assault. The first barrage hit the station's shields like a hammer blow. Warning klaxons screamed throughout the command center. Axe deployed his ships in a defensive formation he had learned from Professor, a modified version of the pattern the Greeks used after Thermopylae. Concentrate force, make the enemy pay for every inch, and never let them see hesitation. His 40 ships engaged 127. The mathematics were cruel. Within the first hour, he had lost 15 vessels, but those ships had taken out 8 Devourer craft and damaged a dozen more. The exchange ratio was better than it should have been because his pilots fought with absolute commitment. No retreats, no hesitation, just constant pressure. Commanded the ground forces, preparing for the inevitable boarding action. He had studied drift obsessively, the battle where a tiny British force held against overwhelming numbers through sheer defensive discipline. He set up kill zones, overlapping fields of fire, and fallback positions that turned every corridor into a death trap. The Devourers breached the station hull on the second day of the simulation. Their boarding craft punched through weakened sections and disgorged mechanical troops that moved with eerie precision. Forces met them with concentrated fire and controlled fury. Axe watched the casualty reports climb. His ships were dying. His troops were dying. The station was dying. But they held. Every hour they survived was one more hour for the reinforcement fleet to arrive. Every destroyed Devourer ship was one less threat to those core worlds. On the third day, the pattern changed. Axe noticed it first in the tactical displays. The Devourers were slowing their assault, not stopping but hesitating. Their ships maintained distance instead of pressing the advantage. Their boarding troops advanced more cautiously. "They're adapting," said, reading the data streams. "Their AI is learning, but it's learning something unexpected." She was right. The Devourer fleet had conquered hundreds of civilizations by calculating optimal attack vectors against defenders who behaved logically. But Station Meridian was not behaving logically. Ships rammed Devourer vessels when their weapons failed. Troops set off explosive traps with themselves still in the kill zone. The station itself, when shields finally collapsed, reconfigured its power systems to overload and damage nearby enemy ships. The Devourer's predictive models were failing because they could not account for defenders who treated their own survival as a secondary concern. On the fifth day, the simulation delivered its final blow. The last defending ship exploded in a desperate ramming action. The last squad of troops died defending the command center. Axe watched his own simulated death as Devourer soldiers breached the final door. The simulation froze. The command center dissolved back into the Academy's training room. Axe stood breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through his body despite knowing it had all been virtual. Professor appeared before the exhausted cadets. "Well done," he said simply. "We died," Axe protested. "We lost. How is that well done?" "Look at the extended timeline," said, bringing up a new display. The simulation continued past their deaths. The reinforcement fleet arrived 2 days later to find the Devourer scout force damaged, disorganized, and most importantly, hesitating. The AI that controlled them had flagged this sector as containing unpredictable defensive behaviors. Instead of pressing forward through the hyperspace lanes, they to recalculate their approach. The 4 core worlds had time to evacuate. 3 billion people reached safety. The reinforcement fleet established a defensive perimeter that held for months, buying time for the larger galactic response. "You died," confirmed. "But you won. Just like the Spartans, just like the Alamo, just like every human last stand we have studied. You turned your defeat into something the enemy could not overcome." Axe sat down heavily. His mathematical mind tried to process what had happened and found that the numbers did not capture it. 7,000 simulated soldiers had held back a fleet that should have swept past them in hours, not through superior tactics or weapons, but through absolute refusal to behave as expected. Was crying, her telepathic sensitivity overwhelmed by the emotional weight of what they had experienced. Even in simulation, the act of choosing to die for others carried a psychic resonance she could barely comprehend. Stood silent, his massive form still and contemplative. Finally, he spoke. "This is not honor as my people understand it, but it is something greater." Other teams had run the same simulation. Most had chosen some variation of retreat and watched their virtual selves survive while billions died later. A few had attempted to stand, but half-heartedly, and been overwhelmed in hours. Only Axe's team had truly committed to the last stand doctrine, and only they had achieved results that changed the simulation's outcome. Commander entered the training room. She looked over the exhausted cadets with an expression that might have been approval. "Now you understand," she said. "The humans did not teach us how to die gloriously. They taught us how to make our deaths matter. There is a difference." She pulled up the real strategic map, not a simulation. The dark stain of the Devourer fleet was visible, closer than it had been months ago. "You have 14 months to master this," said. "Because the simulation you just ran will become real. The Grand Council has decided we will not flee to Andromeda. We will not calculate the safest path to extinction. We will stand. And we will teach the Devourers what every human enemy eventually learned, that some species cannot be conquered because they refuse to accept that conquest is possible." She left them with that thought. Axe looked at his teammates still shaken, grimly determined, the others processing their own reactions. "We need more training," Axe said finally. His voice was steady now, resolved. "If we are going to do this for real, we need to understand it completely. Every human last stand, every tactic, every psychological principle." "Agreed," rumbled. Wiped her eyes and nodded. They returned to their studies with new purpose. The simulations continued, each one refining their understanding. They stopped thinking of last stands as suicide and started seeing them as weapons psychological, strategic, and ultimately effective in ways that traditional warfare could not match. The academy buzzed with similar energy. Every cadet, every instructor, every species representative was preparing for what was coming. The controversial course on human tactics was no longer controversial. It was survival doctrine. 12 months later, the galaxy held its breath. The Devourer fleet had reached the border systems and was advancing steadily. Every projection showed the same result. The combined galactic forces were outnumbered 3-1. The enemy technology was superior. By every logical calculation, resistance was futile. The collective formally proposed mass evacuation to the Andromeda galaxy. It would take decades, and many would die in transit, but some would survive. It was the mathematical choice. Axe stood before the Grand Council for the second time in his life. The young cadet had been asked to present an alternative analysis. His people were famous for their mathematical precision, and the council wanted to hear if the numbers could support any other option. He stood where Commander had stood over a year ago, defending a controversial position. He had prepared his presentation carefully, using every analytical tool his species had perfected. The data floated in the air before the assembled representatives. Honorable Council members, Axe began, his voice carrying clearly, I present what I call the Thermopylae calculation. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some delegates looked intrigued. Others, including members of his own species, looked disapproving. The proposal to flee to Andromeda assumes we will be safe there, Axe continued. But we will not. The Devourers are a machine intelligence designed to expand infinitely. They will follow us. And when they do, we will be weaker. We will have abandoned our industrial base, our resources, our established infrastructure. We will be refugees fighting with whatever we could carry. He advanced the display, showing probability curves. The survival odds in Andromeda, calculated over a 1,000-year timeline, are actually lower than standing and fighting now. Fleeing is not survival, it is delayed extinction. Representative, the same who had argued against human tactics a year ago, stood up. Then what do you propose? We cannot win this battle by any calculation. We cannot win by traditional calculations, Axe agreed. But there is one variable that changes everything, one factor that does not fit neatly into our models. The humans call it morale. I call it strategic unpredictability. He brought up footage from the simulations, showing dozens of teams attempting last-stand scenarios. When defenders believe they can lose, they fight conservatively to minimize losses. The Devourers can predict this. But when defenders accept that loss is certain and fight anyway, not to survive, but to damage the enemy regardless of cost, the prediction models break down. New data appeared. In every simulation where cadets fully committed to last-stand doctrine, the Devourer AI experienced decision cascade failures. The machines cannot process an enemy that gets more dangerous as defeat becomes more certain. It violates every optimization principle their programming understands. The council chamber was completely silent now. Axe pressed his advantage. I propose we make our stand at the expanse. The nebula terrain will negate some of the Devourer's numerical advantage. We position our forces not to win, but to make the enemy pay an unprecedented price for their victory. And we broadcast our defiance on all frequencies, in all languages, so every ship and every soldier understands. We are not fighting to survive. We are fighting to prove that some civilizations cannot be conquered. He paused, then delivered his conclusion. The mathematics are clear. If we flee, we die slowly. If we fight traditionally, we die quickly. But if we fight the way humans taught us, if we weaponize our own willingness to stand against impossible odds, we introduce a variable the Devourers cannot account for. And that variable, honorable delegates, gives us the only real chance we have. The vote took 6 hours. When it concluded, the decision was narrow but definitive. The galaxy would stand. The expanse became a fortress over the following weeks. Every species contributed ships and personnel. The fleet that gathered was the largest military force in galactic history, thousands of vessels representing hundreds of worlds. It still was not enough by traditional metrics. Commander took overall command. She requested a specific group of advisors, and no one was surprised when she chose Professor and his former students, Axe, and joined the command staff of the flagship Defiance. The human fleet, despite Earth being a relatively minor member of the galactic community, was positioned at the most critical point, the central choke point where the Devourer Vanguard would strike first. Captain, a descendant of soldiers who had fought in Earth's bloodiest conflicts, commanded the human vessels. He sent a message to the rest of the fleet. It was simple: "We'll show you how it's done." The Devourer fleet emerged from hyperspace in a formation that was mathematically perfect. They calculated optimal firing solutions and began their assault with mechanical precision. Within the first 10 minutes, 47 galactic ships were destroyed. The logical moment to retreat arrived within the first hour. Standard military doctrine demanded it. The casualties were unsustainable, the enemy advantage overwhelming. The human fleet did not retreat. Instead, Captain opened a broadcast on all frequencies. It carried music, something ancient from Earth, a song about standing firm and refusing to break. Mixed with the music were voices, human voices, speaking in accented galactic common. "This is humanity, we stand. This is Captain, we do not retreat. This is the Earth Defense Force. You want this ground, come take it." The other species heard those transmissions. More importantly, they felt something shift in the collective consciousness of the fleet. Positioned at her communication station on the Defiance, made her own choice. She opened her telepathic abilities wider than she ever had before, dropping all the carefully maintained barriers her people used to avoid overwhelming their sensitive minds. She reached out to every captain, every pilot, every soldier in the fleet. She shared with them what she had finally learned from studying human history, that fear and courage were not opposites. Fear was natural, rational, and appropriate when facing overwhelming odds. Courage was choosing to act despite that fear, to fight for something more important than personal survival. The emotional truth of it flooded through her telepathic link. Species who had never understood each other, who had competed and occasionally warred for, suddenly shared a moment of absolute unity. They were not separate civilizations anymore. They were one force, standing together against an enemy that threatened everything. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Ships that had begun defensive retreats turned back toward the enemy. Weapons crews who had been rationing ammunition for a long fight began firing with maximum intensity. The galactic fleet transformed from a collection of calculating, survival-focused units into something the Devourers had never encountered, an enemy that fought harder as the situation grew more desperate. Led a boarding party onto a damaged Devourer command vessel. His team was mixed warriors, human marines, tactical specialists, even a few whispers who had trained in combat despite their peaceful nature. They fought through the ship's corridors using tactics borrowed directly from Drift, establishing defensive positions and forcing the mechanical defenders to attack uphill. The machines kept coming, their processing power calculating optimal assault patterns, but Force kept adapting in ways that violated the predictions. When ammunition ran low, they used the enemy's weapons. When weapons failed entirely, they used the environment itself, collapsing corridors and overloading power systems. They took casualties, heavy casualties, but they advanced anyway, fighting their way toward the command node that controlled this section of the Devourer fleet. It was not about survival. It was about proving that organic life could make choices machines would never understand. On the Defiance, Axe monitored the tactical situation with a clarity he had never possessed before. His mathematical mind still calculated probabilities, but he had learned to see beyond the numbers. The battle was going badly by every traditional metric. Dozens of ships were dying every hour. The casualties were horrific. But the Devourers were slowing down. Their assault, which should have been a steady, overwhelming advance, had become hesitant and fragmented. The AI that controlled them was experiencing something unprecedented: errors in its prediction models. Every time it calculated how the defenders would respond, they responded differently. When ships were crippled, instead of retreating, they rammed enemy vessels. When boarding actions failed, the defenders set off self-destruct sequences that took Devourer troops with them. When defensive lines collapsed, new ones formed immediately, often with volunteers from species that had never fought together before. "Commander," Axe reported to, "the enemy is showing signs of decision cascade failure. They are pausing to recalculate more frequently. Their attack patterns are becoming inefficient." Studied the displays. She had fought in wars across 3 decades, but nothing like this. "Can we exploit it?" "Not in the traditional sense," Axe said, "but we can make it worse. The more unpredictably we fight, the more errors they make. I recommend we authorize all ships to engage in maximum aggression protocols, regardless of survival probability." He paused, realizing what he was suggesting. A year ago, such a recommendation would have been unthinkable for a. Now it felt like the only logical choice, even if the logic was of a type his people had never embraced before. "Authorized," said without hesitation. The order went out across the fleet. Every ship, every squadron, every individual soldier was given the same directive: fight without regard for survival. Make every action count. Make the enemy pay for every meter of space. The battle reached its critical moment when Captain's flagship was surrounded. His weapons were depleted, his shields were failing, and his crew was down to a quarter strength. The Devourer flagship, a massive construct the size of a small moon, loomed before him. Gathered his surviving crew. They were battered, exhausted, and they knew exactly what he was about to propose. He did not waste words. "We can eject and be picked up by another ship," he said. "Or we can make this count. This vessel still has propulsion. That flagship has shields, but shields can be overwhelmed by kinetic impact if the mass is sufficient and the velocity is high enough." His crew looked at each other. They were human, and they had been raised on the stories ancestor had told him, passed down through generations. Stories of impossible battles and defiant stands. Stories that taught that some things mattered more than living to see tomorrow. "Let's make it count," his first officer said. The rest nodded agreement. Opened one final broadcast. Every ship in both fleets heard it. "This is Captain of the Earth Defense Force. This is humanity. We do not calculate surrender. We do not optimize for survival. We defy. We stand. And when standing is not enough, we make our ending matter." He aimed his dying ship at the Devourer flagship and pushed the engines to maximum. The vessel accelerated, automated safety systems screaming warnings that were ignored. The distance closed in seconds that felt like hours. The impact was relatively insignificant. One medium-sized cruiser against a flagship, the size of a city, could not do meaningful damage, even at ramming speed. The enemy shields absorbed most of the kinetic energy. The explosion that followed was spectacular but ultimately harmless to the vast construct. But something else happened in that moment. Every single ship in the Galactic Fleet, watching that final act of defiance, responded. Without orders, without coordination, without any central planning, they all began broadcasting the same message. "We stand, we defy." The words came in 100 languages from 1,000 ships. Cruisers abandoned their optimized firing patterns and charged forward. Whisper vessels, designed for communication and survey work, armed their minimal weapons and entered combat for the first time. Battleships pushed their engines beyond safe limits. Axe watched from the Defiance's command center, and saw the moment when the Devourer fleet broke. It was not a mechanical failure or a tactical collapse. It was something more fundamental. The AI that controlled the enemy fleet experienced what computer scientists would later call a complete paradigm failure. The Devourer's entire operational logic was built on consuming civilizations that calculated survival odds and acted accordingly. When those civilizations fled, the Devourers followed. When they fought defensively, the Devourers overwhelmed them. When they surrendered, the Devourers processed them. But an entire galaxy choosing to fight with absolute disregard for survival, choosing defiance over calculation, choosing to stand when standing was mathematically absurd, that was not something the AI could process. It tried to recalculate. It attempted to find the optimal response. And in trying to optimize against an enemy that was not optimizing their own survival, its decision trees cascaded into recursive loops. The Devourer fleet began to retreat, not a fighting withdrawal but actual retreat, ships pulling back to regroup and reanalyze. The Galactic fleet pursued without mercy. The Battle of Expanse lasted 17 hours. When it ended, the Devourer fleet was